Hey guys, I'm Saurabh, and in this video let's talk about long exposure photography. So long exposure photography is a technique in which you expose your camera for like half a second, 1 second, 10 seconds or even an hour. So with long exposure photography you can create amazing looking images with all kinds of motion blur and silky waterfalls. So for creating long exposure you need a camera, that's obvious. You need a tripod for stable shots, and a remote is optional, and we'll see how we'll deal with it. So basically this video will be divided into two sections. In the first section I will explain you all the camera settings you need to create long exposures, and we will also shoot an image so that you understand in a better way. And in the second part I will give you some tips and tricks to create high quality long exposure images. So without wasting any time, let's get started. So let's talk about the settings. Very first thing is to switch to manual mode, because that's going to give you a lot of flexibility. So switch to manual mode, and the first thing that we are going to do is focusing. Now you can also use autofocusing, but I recommend manual focusing for fine tuning. Okay, so focus on the subject first, and then if you can't focus, if it's too dark after sunset or before sunrise, open up your lens to the highest aperture. Like for example, my lens allows me to go up to f2.8. So I will switch to f2.8, I will then focus, and again I will switch to manual focus. It is very important to switch to manual focus, because when you're shooting you don't want your focus to be changing continuously, right? So once you're done focusing, switch to manual focus and you're good with the focusing. The next thing is to set the aperture. Now most of the times when you're shooting long exposures, you will be shooting landscape scenes where you want everything to be in focus. So you have to set the aperture like from f8 to f11. Okay, f8 is a good starting point. If you want to create starburst effect, you can maybe use f14 or f16, and you get those gorgeous sun star or star looking images when you have light source in your images. So depends on what kind of look do you want, you have to set the aperture. The next thing is to set the shutter speed. Now shutter speed is the most important setting in long exposure photography, because that is going to decide the overall look of the image. Like for example, if the objects are moving very fast, you can use a shutter speed of like maybe 1 second or 2 seconds, and still you will get the motion blur. If the objects are moving slow, maybe increase the shutter speed to about 10 seconds, 20 seconds or 30 seconds, and that depends on like what kind of look do you want. Okay, that depends on the look and the motion blur you want to capture. Okay, of course if you keep the shutter open for longer period of time, you will get more motion blur. So depending on the look you want, set the shutter speed. Now the issue is our DSLRs only allow us to keep the shutter speed to a maximum of 30 seconds. Does that mean you cannot click an exposure that's more than 30 seconds? No, you can. For that you have to switch to bulb mode. So let me explain you what bulb mode is. Bulb mode is a mode where the camera will expose its shutter for the time you press the shutter button. So for example, if you hold the shutter button for 1 second, it will expose for 1 second. If you hold it for a minute, it will expose for 1 minute. So it depends on how long you want the shutter speed to be, and you have to press the shutter button for that much amount of time. Now when you're doing this, you might introduce some camera shake, and that will result in like shaky images, and for that I recommend using a remote. So when you connect a remote, you just have to press the switch, and once you're done with it, you have to just take it down and you're done. So using a remote will prevent all that camera shake that you get. So switch to bulb mode and use a remote if you want to capture longer exposures than 30 seconds. So the last thing is setting the ISO. Now for setting the ISO, you have to see the light meter. Now if you're not comfortable by how to use the manual mode, there's a video on my channel. The link will be popping up in the cards above, and it will be there in the description below. So basically we will see if it's too dark and if it's too bright. So if it's on the negative side of the light meter, that means it is too dark, so we will increase the ISO. If it's to the positive side of the light meter, it means it's too bright, so we will decrease the ISO. So depending on the light meter, we are going to adjust the ISO so that we get properly exposed images. So these are all the settings that you have to keep in mind for shooting long exposure images. Now let's talk about some tips and tricks for getting good long exposure images. The first tip I can give you is to use a very good and sturdy tripod. So basically sturdy tripod will give you sharp images. The second tip I can give you is you should turn off any kind of image stabilization that's present in the lens. So if you have any kind of image stabilization, like for VC, VR, or image stabilization, these are basically image stabilization provided by different lenses. So if you have them, turn them off, because since your camera is going to be on a tripod, those image stabilization techniques are not going to do anything. So better turn them off. The third thing I can give you as a tip is basically try to use a remote. So when you press the shutter button, sometimes what happens is when you press it, you introduce a slight camera shake, and that doesn't look good. So if you have a remote, that's good, you know, because you don't have any physical direct contact with the camera, so you do not introduce any camera shake. And if you don't have any particular remote, or if you don't have it right now, what you can do is you can always use a timer method. So once you set your timer to maybe 2 seconds or 5 seconds, and then you press the shutter button, it will take the image after 2 seconds, so that when you press the shutter button, even if there is a shake, the camera won't pick up, because it's starting to take the image after 2 or 5 seconds. Like, that depends upon the timer. So I hope you enjoyed the video, guys, and I hope you learned about long exposure photography. I always recommend to keep experimenting, and long exposure photography is all about experimenting with different shutter speeds, okay? Try to play with different shutter speeds. Even if you feel a 20-second exposure looks good, it doesn't harm you. Like, try a 10-second exposure, try a 30-second exposure, go home, and later, it might happen that you like a different image. So keep experimenting and keep producing great images. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, press the like button, subscribe to my channel. I will talk to you guys in the next one. Bye.